Hi there, my name is Emma and welcome to my channel. I make videos on art, upcycling, and DIYs, and today, some miniatures. Today I'm doing something a little bit different because I typically don't make long format versions of my miniatures. If you follow me on any other platforms or you watch my shorts, you'll know that I have been making a miniature greenhouse. It's been a 20-part series where I've done a bunch of additions to the greenhouse, as well as filling it up with plants, a potting station, a table, lots of fun stuff. Normally I just share it on my shorts, but I thought today it might be fun to do a long version and kind of go in depth on how I made a polymer clay Monstera plant. This is my first time doing a video like this, so let me know if you enjoy it and if you want to see more miniatures content. Now let's get into the video. The first thing we're going to do is start out with some polymer clay. These are the colors I used. I generally tend to prefer Sculpting Primo, but for some reason I had this Sculpting 3, which is just not as good quality, but I like to use what I have, and these two colors ended up working out pretty well. One of them was a little bit sparkly. It had some shimmer in there, which I didn't realize at first, but I started mixing them together and then rolling it out. And as I was doing that, I was trying to pop any bubbles that came up because we don't want our Monstera leaves to have any bubbles in them. Once it was rolled out, I pulled it off and moved it to the side in order to make a template. I ended up making 2 templates just so I kind of memorized the general idea of the leaf. I was looking at my reference photos as I was doing this. A lot of the times they have an uneven amount of slits on either side, so I did 3 slits on one side and 2 on another side, and then I made another template that had maybe like 3 versus 4 slits, and I just cut it out to help me as I started making sure I get all of my shapes right. But eventually I did end up making ones that were smaller, some that were bigger, and just added some variation. In order to cut them out, I laid the template directly on my clay, and then I used an X-Acto knife. There were times when I traced the whole outline and then cut out the slits, and there were times that I did it all at once. I found that tracing the outline and then doing the slits was a little bit better, but each time I had to take it out and then remove the little parts that were in the slits, these little balls of clay, and then set it aside. Here's my other template, which has a few more slits in it, and I just carefully went and I did all of these by hand. It did take a long time, but if you're listening to a good audiobook or maybe some good music, I really enjoyed myself. I felt like this was a very peaceful process. As you can tell, my clay is not incredibly thin. It gets really hard to work with when it's super thin, so once these are cut out, we're going to kind of thin out the edges. They'll still be a little bit thicker than a typical Monstera leaf, but it's still pretty realistic. I also did some ones that didn't have any slits, and I made some that were smaller. The fastest way to do it was to cut everything out first and then remove all of the excess clay. And then it was time to thin out the edges. I started by making sure everything was smooth and then pressing my fingers down on the edges. This tool is actually a weeding tool from Cricut, but you can use a toothpick or the end of a brush to make some veining. And then I also added some extra holes, which some leaves have. I then folded the leaf in half and then kind of curled the edges back to almost make, like if you're looking at it from the side, an M shape, because you want to make sure there's movement on there. So I did this individually to every single leaf. I think the thing that made it the most realistic was definitely flattening out those edges and creating these curves. Here's a little bit of a closer view at that process, just flattening out those edges, making sure there are no harsh lines or edges. We want this to look as natural as possible. After the sculpting was done, I went and grabbed my chalk pastels, and I'm going to do a little bit of shading. I ended up using this dark green color and a dry brush, a nice small dry brush, and I'm just doing the edges just to give it some extra dimension. What I like to use is the opposite side of the brush to kind of loosen some of the chalk pastels, and then I went over all of the edges just to make sure that they're a little bit more interesting to look at. Once that was done, it's finally time to bake them, so I grabbed my baking sheet and I made sure they were all positioned how I wanted them to be before I put them in the oven. So I went through and made sure everyone was curved in the way I wanted it to be before baking them at 275 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 minutes. While that was in the oven, I realized I didn't have a pot to put them in. So I took a bunch of scrap white clay and I mixed it all up, and it ended up making this really nice marble pattern. I was initially planning on painting it, but I actually really liked the way it turned out. I made kind of like a tube shape, and then I began to cut out the center because I realized I'd probably want to put some wires or something inside it. So I cut out the center and I made sure to tap it a bunch of times to make it nice and even. But I really like how the marbling ended up, even though it was a bunch of scrap clay. So after the leaves were done, I also baked that as well. Next, I grabbed this floral wire, which is going to be perfect for the stems, and some hot glue. And I just put a bunch of hot glue at the bottom, and I started off with 3 or 4 wires. I actually had to hold them to let them dry. This part of the process ended up being a ton of holding because each thing took like 30 seconds. So I put a bunch of wires in, and then each one of these leaves I held for like 30 seconds, and I made sure all the wires had some curves and movement in them. The thing about Monstera leaves is they do all tend to face one direction. So I was only looking at this from the front as I was doing it, and I was making sure they were all angled in the way that I wanted them to be. I think most Monstera leaves tend to have their own stalks, but just to make my life a little bit easier, I did add multiple leaves to each individual wire. I then realized I made too many leaves, so I decided to use this old clay pot that I had made to make an extra smaller one. I had a lot of small leaves left over, so I did that little one as well. This is how the large one turned out. I think it's so cool and dimensional. The back isn't very pretty, but mainly it's going to be seen from above because this is for my miniature greenhouse, so I was keeping that in mind as I was making it. The little one turned out super cute as well, and you can see those little leaves that don't have splits in them look perfect, especially for that size. I really wanted this to take up a lot of space in my greenhouse, and like I said, it's seen from above, so I think that's definitely its best angle. I love how the shading added a bunch of dimension, and I think it looks so amazing. I am so happy with how it turned out. This project may have taken forever, but I am so happy with the result. It turned out so adorable, and feel free to let me know in the comments if you have any suggestions for the greenhouse on what I should do next. Let me know if you enjoyed this type of video, if you want to see more miniatures, and if you want to see the whole greenhouse and all of the parts. They're all on my YouTube Shorts, my Instagram, and my TikTok. Be sure to let me know what type of content that I make is your favorite. Do you want more miniatures? Do you want more room renovations? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and happy making!